Yeah.
Yes.
Well, there are people who are joining us already, so.
Oh, we're live. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute while people come in and join the stream. But in the meantime, why don't you tell us where you're watching from?
Up here's somebody from Poland. Welcome, Marimuros. Nice. Oh.
Wow, we've got some people watching from a blizzard. Hope you're staying warm.
Wow.
We actually had a tiny bit of snow here in North Carolina.
Just a lot of wind here in Virginia.
We're just chilly in Mississippi.
And then how is it in Chawton?
I think it's a little chilly at Chawton, but not as much snow as there was last week. Although, obviously, a very British response to snow, which is to panic at 6 inches of snow.
Love to hear from more of you where you're viewing from. All right.
All right, well, let us begin. Welcome, everyone, back to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I am the co-director for Jane Austen and Company. And tonight I am joined by my wonderful co-hosts, Inga Brody and Susan Allen Ford, as well as our stunning technical director, Malika Emaruso. And tonight is a very special night because we are launching our new series, Everyday Science in the Regency, where we're looking at science and technology, but we're looking at the kind of practical day-to-day understandings of science and technology that would have informed daily life in the Regency.
And it's my pleasure to welcome Katie Childs, who's director of Chawton House, and to talk about Botanical Women. And this is an exhibit based on an exhibit that occurred at Chawton House. I actually had the pleasure of going there and hearing Katie talk, give her curators talk on this exhibit. So I'm excited to hear the new things she's added.
And I'm getting to introduce Katie Childs. Katie's the chief executive of Chawton House. She was a graduate of Girton College, the University of Cambridge, and trustee of Ely Museum and the Collections Trust. Katie joined Chawton House as chief executive in February 2019 from the Imperial War Museums, where she led the First World War centenary commemorations, managed large events, and established a new Second World War and Holocaust partnership program, and the War and Conflict Subject Specialist Network, all as part of her role as head of partnerships and strategic relations. She's also worked at the British Museum, where she negotiated the loan of 90 Afghan treasures that had been hidden from the Taliban, developed museum partnerships in India and East and West Africa, ran the World Collections Program, and worked with the British Army to safeguard the cultural heritage in Iraq. When she's not working, it's hard to imagine when that might be, Katie is usually found watching Manchester United or the cricket, walking, cooking, clearing her overgrown garden, or on the train to her hometown of Bolton.
I'll hand things over to Malika to explain the Q&A, please. And Malika's joining us.
Welcome to YouTube. Yeah, apologies. I'm joining from the mountains, so apologies if my audio is spotty today. But welcome to YouTube, our new streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, please use the comment feature on the sidebar. It should be on your right. We will collect questions during the event to ask during the Q&A, but you'll need a Google or YouTube account to leave questions. But if you don't have that account, you can email us your questions at info@janeaustinandco.org.
All right, thank you so much, Malika. Do note that tonight's program will be recorded. If all goes well, it will be available at this same link immediately following the event. Although if there are technical difficulties, we do reserve the right to pull the talk to edit out those difficulties. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Katie Childs.
Thank you very much, Anne. And one of the technical difficulties is the fact that Anne is going to move on the slides for me when I move on from one to another, because she's far more technically minded than I am. But it's absolutely lovely to join you this evening from, well, I'm not actually at Chawton House tonight because of the time difference. So I'm joining you from South London. But if you move the next slide, please. That's lovely. That is Chawton House, which is in the village of Chawton, outside of the market town of Alton in northeast Hampshire. So a little sort of to the west of London. It is an absolutely beautiful place for those who have not had the opportunity to come and see it. It is a kind of Elizabethan manor house within an estate of 250 acres with a lovely formal garden. And that I'll talk a little bit about throughout the talk. We're open to the public. And we have, we're open 7 days a week in the summer, and we hold a series of exhibitions. And one of those exhibitions, as Inga said, was Botanical Women, which is what I'm going to talk about this evening. Now, Chawton House is probably best known because it was owned by Jane Austen's brother, Edward. And the story as to how Edward comes to inherit not just this estate, but another one in Kent, at Godmersham Park in Kent, is really, well, it's really like a plot line almost from one of his sister's novels. And that's a subject of another talk, and actually the story of the house for visitors when people come to see it. But in 1809, Edward made a cottage available for Jane and Cassandra, her sister, and their mother, and friend Martha Lloyd, in the village of Chawton. So it would have been an estate cottage. It was actually the bailiff's cottage in the centre of the village. And that's what brought Jane Austen to the village of Chawton, which is, of course, from where she had wrote, finished, completed, and sent out into the world the 6 novels that makes her the world famous author that she is today. Now, Jane Austen would have been very familiar with Chawton House and the Chawton estates, not least that, well, pretty much every time she opened the front door, she'd be walking across land owned by her brother. But she called Chawton House the Great House and writes that she will come up to the Great House. They dine there, spent time with family, and it really is a significant influence on her writing. She's a fabulous magpie as a writer, I suppose, and you see all sorts of little glimpses of Chawton House and the family history and some of the things that are within the house still today throughout the course of her novels. Now, if you just move the next slide, please, Anne. This is the back of the house looking down towards St Nicholas Church. We have a beautiful 15-acre garden, and this part of the garden, this sort of south lawn looking down towards the house, is one of the most beautiful views in the property. Next slide, please. Just lovely, thank you. And today we are home not just to the family, the Knight family. Edward, when he inherited, had one condition, which was to change his name to Knight. So the family who own the freehold of the house today are the Knight family, and are direct descendants from Jane Austen. But we, as the Chawton House Library charity, which is formally what I am the director of, we have an over 100-year lease to run Chawton House and the whole estate. And within that, as part of saving the house when it was in a state of disrepair in the late part of the 20th century, was to turn it into a centre for women's writing. And as a result of the generosity of the philanthropist Sandy Lerner, the house was not just renovated, but we became custodians of this extraordinary collection of, well, depends what you count, but around about 12,000 works by women writers. We predominantly collect works of women who were writing between about 1600 and about 1900. And the room you see a glimpse into is the restored library within the house that all visitors see as they go in. And it's actually home to part of the collection as well. The collection is out on display. And it's from that collection, inspired by the fact that the house was an inspiration in itself to Jane Austen, that we pull some of the works and some of the stories of the writers that I'm going to share with you today. So next slide, please. Thank you. But I wanted to start with Jane Austen, and we did feature Jane Austen in this exhibition. And when I talk about botanical women, I'm really talking about a kind of full range of the writers and women featured in our collection, whether they're writers, whether they are teachers, whether they're illustrators, scientists in a kind of broad sense, or garden designers, or just gardeners. And indeed, Jane Austen's letters between her and Cassandra show how they created their garden at Chawton Cottage in the village. And I've included on this slide various plants that she mentions in letters or that they have at the cottage. So there's a peony, there are things like what you would then have called a lady's bonnet, we would now call aquiledias, sweet williams, pinks. The garden at Chawton Cottage would probably have what we would now call wild flowers, herbs, and as I said, a peony, and she talks about a fir tree in the garden as well. So there would be sort of maybe more of a wild garden than the more carefully kept gardens that you imagine later into the 19th century. And there was a reason for that. There is now, if we wish to create a garden, it's very easy for us to walk over to a garden centre, or when we're in the supermarket, to pick some plants up alongside our groceries. That, of course, was a world away from the early part of the 19th century. You would collect seeds, you would swap seeds and exchange seeds. If you went to visit someone, you would probably keep a beady eye out on the garden of what you wanted to take cuttings of or collect and transplant to your own garden. In some respect, your garden was a reflection of your social circle and where you lived, and the plants that you physically had access to. Jane writes to Cassandra, where Cassandra's staying with Edward and his family at Godmersham Park, and implores her to collect mignonette seeds because she'd like to grow mignonette seeds. Though later in 1811, she writes again to Cassandra when she's on another trip to Godmersham Park to sort of give her an update of how the garden is progressing at Chawton Cottage. And she's very critical sometimes of Cassandra's gardening technique. She says, "Your mignonettes make a wretched appearance," although she's more positive that the whole of the shrubbery border will soon be very gay with pinks and sweet williams. So you can imagine a country cottage with a sort of beautiful floral shrubbery border. And it's into the shrubbery that, or connected to the shrubbery, that we look into our first writer, our first botanical woman. So next slide, please. And that's Henrietta Knight, Lady Luxborough. Now, I should say that this is not one of our knights, which is a bit of a relief, because Henrietta was married to a pretty dreadful man, and indeed, I maybe should have called the exhibition "She Was Married to a Dreadful Man," and therefore escaped into the garden. The Robert Knight, who is Henrietta's husband, is one of the rogues gallery, of where his wife succeeded in spite of the man she was married to. Although maybe in this case because of the man she was married to. Now you can see she from the portrait, she's clearly quite a wealthy woman. But she created a truly unique garden in the West Midlands in the first half of the 18th century. Next slide, please. Now, Henrietta Knight was, her husband suspected that she was having an affair. And whether she was or wasn't, we of course can't be sure, but she did write some poetry that may make you blush, intended for the tutor of her friend's child. So it's her friend is Lady Hertford, and the tutor and Henrietta exchange some sort of beautifully written and heartfelt poetry, which she maintained wasn't as suggestive as her husband made out. And she may have got away with the poetry had Lady Hertford not been so impressed with it and copied it out into what was effectively a kind of visitor's book, so it could be seen by people and gossiped about back in London. Her husband found out and he banished her. He banished her to a rundown estate that he owned in the West Midlands in Warwickshire. There's a saying in England that is, you are sent to Coventry if you are kind of banished. She was literally sent to Coventry. Now, to give you a description as to what Barrels must have been like, her 89-year-old Aunt Chumley, who I'm not sure I would have messed with, writes, "Curse that damned wet ditch she has been thrown into, that she lives at all is a miracle." Now, Henrietta, when you read her letters from that period, so she's distraught, he gives her very limited resources. She has effectively a kind of travel ban. She doesn't really have a coach or means of travel for the first period of time she's at Barrels. She has some staff, but not many. There is about 7, and she has 57 acres and the farmhouse or the farm cottage that she lives in. And as Aunt Chumley so beautifully says, it's in a state of considerable disrepair. And what Henrietta does is sort of stand up to the challenge. She knows that her husband won't divorce her, and she knows he won't allow her to have access to her children. So she throws herself into creating not just a working farm at Barrels that will keep her alive and keep the 7 members of staff who are dependent on her, but that she will make an attractive landscape. What she creates, she calls a ferme orne, which is a sort of a kind of landscaped farm, so somewhere that is both productive and beautiful. And she sets about creating this, as I said, truly unique garden. And she does quite a lot of this herself. She has very limited resources. So as you can see on the left-hand letter, which is sent to her good friend William Shenstone, who lives about 30 miles away and is creating a very similar garden at a place called Lees's. She says, "I will send you to sow in the spring some Star of Bethlehem and some layers of passion flowers for your hermit." He had a hermitage of limited success, I think. So they're swapping seeds. They swap ideas. And she works a lot off memory of places she'd seen when she was in her husband's favour, to sort of design this garden and this landscape. She is clearly one of the most maybe exciting or exotic things to have happened to rural Warwickshire at that time. And over a period of time, she becomes friends at the sort of centre of this coterie of poets and artists and some of the early industrialists in Birmingham, which was relatively close by. And it's through these, William Shenstone is one of those. He's a sort of amateur poet, and they exchange, they've sort of similar sensibilities, and they exchange ideas. I said we headed into the shrubbery, because as the middle letter shows her talking about her different features, her parterre and the shrubbery in her garden. And the letter between her and Shenstone in 1748 is thought it could be the first mention of the word and description shrubbery. So if that's Henrietta Knight's long-term impact, long-term sort of horticultural legacy, then I think that's a pretty impressive one. Now, this coterie are probably a set of a fairly lovelorn poets who adore her. And although her garden doesn't survive more than 40 years after her death, it's because Shenstone published the letters in tribute to her in the 1750s that we know some of the details of the garden. And we also know some of it from some of the poetry that she and her garden inspired. And Mr. Perks writes a whole poem. It's an absolutely beautiful poem, all about the shell and enameled grotto, which is like a sort of shelter that she creates in the garden. He finishes it in lively tints, so natural, so true, a piece more perfect Titian never drew. Thus taste, plight, and judgment more refined, feast the admiring eye and cultivate the mind. And it's through that writing that Henrietta Knight's garden survives. If you could just move the next slide on. There's a little bit, it gives you a sense of just how precarious trying to sort of swap plants and letters and things are. In this letter, she is somewhat troubled that she's given the wrong package intended for Shenstone to someone completely different in Birmingham. And that's a story that is repeated on the next slide with these two women. They don't have some of the privations that Henrietta Knight was enduring. But the lady on the left, Elizabeth Montague, has is creating a garden and a townhouse in Bloomsbury, and which she has hot houses. She's wealthy, so it's a great signifier of wealth. And of course, if you've got a hot house, you're going to need to have citrus trees to sort of demonstrate that you can grow these exotic plants. So she requests that her friend on the right, the Duchess of Portland, one of the wealthiest women in the country, creating a botanic garden, a place called Bulstrode, sort of just outside of Nottingham, sends her 12 orange trees. And that's how she is going to acquire her orange trees. We know this story from the book that's in the centre of this slide, which is a collected of Elizabeth Montague's collected letters, edited by her great niece Emily Clemenson. And Emily explains that the 12 orange trees for Mrs. Montague's London garden would come from Bulstrode. They were to be sent to the Red Lion in Slough, where the Newbury carrier, I should say, would collect them. Mrs. Montague's letter takes up the story. She says, the poor waggoner who was to have brought them was unhappily killed some days ago by a loaded waggon falling on him. His servant foolishly left the orange trees because he had no room for them. And at 9 o'clock at night, they brought word to us the orange trees were left at Slough. We immediately sent servants with a cart who travelled almost all day and brought the trees safe the next day. Slough's not that far away from here. I'm not sure I get at 9 o'clock at night, get in my car to go and pick up 12 orange trees, but they were clearly very important to Mrs. Montague. Next slide. And that's the kind of the danger in a way, and the kind of peril of trying to send plants from one place to another does improve, obviously, as the transport system certainly in England improves. So if you fast forward nearly sort of about 80 years or so to the writer Mary Russell Mitford, she is also creating a garden at the back of her various different houses that she lives in, and she is more of a contemporary of Austin. She was born in Alresford, which is not that far away from Chawton, but the gardens that she creates through her life are in Berkshire, which is a little bit to the north of Hampshire. If you move next slide, please. She is known as she's a prose and poetry writer. And the book on the right is, I think, one of the most beautiful book covers that we have in the Chawton House collection. We have various different editions of her most famous work, prose work, Our Village, but that one is my favourite. and she is an inveterate letter writer. There are known to be about 2,000 of her letters, and the one on the left is one of our latest additions to the Chawton House collection, which is one of Mary Russell Mitford's letter. This is actually on display in our current exhibition, Quills and Characters, which is all about letter writing. But it's really within those letters, and anytime she's talking about the garden, that her writing is just so lively and so joyous. And I suppose in a way, she never married. She was a single woman, and she wrote in some ways so she had an income, and so she could also kind of look after her father, who was not a terrible man. He was dreadful with money. He was a bit feckless, and but really, in a garden, a woman could find a kind of freedom that was probably otherwise lacking in most parts of the 19th century society. And she herself says, "My great amusement is my garden. It is a pretty thing to be queen over roses and lilies." So it shows that kind of independence and control that she achieves in the garden. She writes that in a letter in 1824. Now, in order for her to create her garden spaces, she collects seeds from her friends. She stays with the Wordsworths at Rydal Mount in Cumbria, and she collects seeds from their garden and brings those down to Berkshire. But one of her letters in 1835, which I'll read a little of, shows her sheer joy of the kind of almost a technological change that has meant that she can transport cuttings and send cuttings through the post. So this letter is 1835. It's to her friend Emily Jeffson, and Emily lives in Ireland, a place called Castlemartyr in Ireland, and she writes, "I write immediately, my dearest Emily, to say that we shall avail ourselves of the knowledge that plants can reach you safely, to send 3 or 4 pots with little geraniums, last year's cuttings, and the white chrysanthemum which you have not, and which gardeners hereabouts call button white. I hope that it will blow well." So the sheer joy and excitement that she can share her plants with Emily in Ireland, I think is just really beautifully written. But it does show how women were creating these garden spaces themselves. Next slide, please. So throughout the sort of from the kind of middle of the 18th century onwards, there's this widespread interest in botany, and landscapes, plants, botany and landscape. It's the age of enlightenment. It's fueled by advances in sea travel, so plant collecting can take place, but it's also the development of the European empire powers. So there's kind of more familiarity and travel as well. And it's the introduction of new species, certainly to the UK and Europe. And this prompts kind of new sort of discussion and thought on the development of new ideas and debates about kind of man's control over nature. And a lot of those debates were taking place in all male spaces, so things like learned societies. And women had to be very clever to kind of explore the cracks within those in order to have some influence. So things like salons, like the ones run by the aforementioned Elizabeth Montagu, they offered the opportunity for men and women to discuss together. If women were maybe wealthier, like the Duchess of Portland, they could support collecting or support research with their collections. Or like Jane Austen, writers could comment or document some of these changes and some of the debates that were taking place. So Austen particularly talks about the debate of man's control over landscape and the changing landscape in Mansfield Park, where there is a sort of extended consideration of the work of the great landscape architects. She mentions Repton, I think it's 5 times in Mansfield Park, and Repton, along with Capability Brown and William Kent, were these sort of great garden landscape designers who manipulated landscapes to create this kind of so-called perfect landscape, where your river would be in the place that you would want it to be. And these huge landscape projects that really changed how some parts of the British countryside looked. Now, a lot of the garden features that Jane Austen discusses are actually within the Chawton House garden, things like the ha-ha that separates the farm sort of wider estate from the formal gardens, the wilderness as well. And we still do have a really rather beautiful wilderness at Chawton House. And indeed, Repton was probably a garden designer with which she was familiar at her Stoneleigh Abbey, which is her mother's estate, family estate, of course. They had asked Humphrey Repton to create a plan for Stoneleigh Abbey. He created what he called his red books, which were his plans for kind of big country houses. I don't think they used Repton's design, but she would have been familiar with those sorts of debates. So if there's the kind of debates around gardens and women in a way are kind of teaching themselves about how to propagate plants and how to create gardens, as Mary Russell Mitford was, what about the sort of teaching of botany and the sort of development of botany more as a science rather than just within gardens? Well, if we move on to the next slide, then we start to look into one of the really big significant changes in botany and horticulture from the middle of the 18th century onwards. And that biggest change came with Carl Linnaeus's publication in 1753 of his plant classification system. So before then, there was no single plant classification system. Plants had different names in different places. And as I explained, with the kind of increase in travel, and you may have a bluebell, which means something very different in Scotland than it does in Germany, for example. And so there was an obvious need with the development of kind of botanical science and the sort of opening up of various parts of the world to kind of more regular travel, that you would need some sort of standardization. And Carl Linnaeus, he's a pretty good promoter of his system as well. I mean, it's his botanists from Uppsala University, his students, who go out and work in some of the great botanical gardens in the world and take his system with them. And Jane Austen probably, she definitely knew of Linnaeus. Of course, she writes about him or mentions him in a letter to Frank, her brother, when his ship is headed to Sweden. The Godmersham Park Library, so her brother's library at Godmersham Park, had a copy of Erasmus Darwin's translation of Linnaeus's work. And Erasmus Darwin translates the work into English, and that edition popularizes again within the kind of English-speaking world, Carl Linnaeus's work. There is, though, a couple of problems with the Linnaean system. And don't worry, I'm not going to try and explain it because it is very complicated. That is the first one. If you're going to try and classify over 7,000 plant species, it's going to be a little bit complicated. There's also something else with Linnaeus, which is a bit challenging in the 18th century, and that is that he uses the language of human relationships to discuss how plants propagate. So you're on fairly safe ground with kind of monogamy, but then he moves into kind of polygamy and discussions of reproduction. And how on earth are we going to teach this to our children? This is we can't offend people's sensibilities. And so step forward a number of women writers who in a way lead this creation of a new genre of literature that's really well represented in the Chawton House collection, which is a kind of educational fiction where you take the complex system of Linnaeus' plant classifications and you create a story aimed at children or those who are educating children in order to simplify the different classes. And usually it's some sort of story where they go through their plant classifications in order and create a narrative that shows the uses of the plants, the characteristics of the plants, and maybe some kind of references to folklore or how they're used on a day-to-day basis. And one of the women who did this is Maria Jackson. And she's one of the kind of first writers actually to do this. And she starts she publishes her first work, Botanical Dialogues, which is aimed at the teaching of children in 1797. It's so popular and it has these beautiful illustrations to show the kind of different parts of plants as well. But it's so popular, not just for the teaching of children, but for adults who want to try and understand the Linnaean system, that she writes a version for adults called Botanical Lectures. And we have both in the collection. I mention her in the context of Erasmus Darwin because they were part of the same intellectual circle in Lichfield in the Midlands, and so she is a very well regarded member of the kind of intellectual circles in Lichfield. But what she does with this book, and if you could move on to the next slide, is she creates a storyline between a mother and children, which explains Linnaeus and the use of plants. And most of them, like Mariah Jackson, weave in her social attitudes into some of this narrative. A lot of the women who are writing these works have had a good standard of education. They're usually from some sort of non-conformist background, and the kind of explanation of this is almost for sort of social improvements through the works. So she actually takes on Linnaeus's gendered language of not all the writers do this, but she bemoans women's dependency on men. She uses the arguments of kind of weak plants won't survive. If a plant is weakened, it won't survive. To sort of rail against the evils of excessive alcohol consumption. She's also a proper scientist. She conducts scientific experiments on her kitchen table, and of the 4 books that she writes, all of which are successful, the third one, which is the one we don't have at Chawton, is a proper scientific kind of textbook, if you like, about how plants are propagated. The reason she has these social attitudes is that her brother Shallcross is. I'm sorry, he's another dreadful man in the exhibition. He drunk and gambled, both her and her sister Frances, and we have Frances's work as well in the collection. He drunk and gambled away their living. A benevolent relative gifted them a property called Summershoal Hall when he found out the sort of what Shallcross was like. And in that house, finally, with her independence, Maria escapes into the garden, and her 4th book is actually a gardening book. It's the most popular. It's called A Florist's Manual, and is basically how to create a flower garden, in which she is very exacting about what you should do. Next slides, please. So that shows that the book has a sort of recommendation from Erasmus Darwin. So it shows her how well connected she was. Next slide. And the real kind of godmother of this sort of literature is a lady called Priscilla Wakefield, who writes Introduction to Botany in 1796. She does this as a series of letters between 2 sisters, and that's again as a kind of common feature of this literature, where the older, this is sisters in this case, the older sister is answering the questions of the younger sister, and again they go through the Linnaean system through the 28 letters in order. This book is phenomenally successful. It's in print for 40 years. It goes into 11 editions. It's translated into French, and it's not even her most successful work. Botany is just one thing in a subject on which she is so knowledgeable to write this sort of educational or improving literature. Next slide. She is a Quaker. She is the mother of the very well-known British prison reformer Elizabeth Fry. And almost writing is the thing she's least known for, because of how successful a social reformer and the changes, particularly for the rights of women and mothers, and the conditions, the living conditions of both, that she successfully implements. But this is the preface to Botany, and it does give you a sense of this kind of social improving, where she says its advantage contributes to the health of body and cheerfulness of disposition by presenting an inducement to take air and exercise. So being outdoors is a good thing. It's a good part of education, as was on the next slide. Botanical illustration. And we've got a couple of extraordinary works in the collection which show how, and this is particularly girls were taught botanical illustration. And these are very large copybooks, which are absolutely spectacular, where you would have these coloured plates, on this one of a peony. And if you move on to the next slide, They would be accompanied by a description as to how you would mix your paints or your dyes in order to, and how firmly or not you would press with your brush strokes to achieve the beautiful plate before, and then use this black and white line drawing. You kind of fill it in. It's a bit like paint by numbers, but way more complicated. And this one is by a woman called Miss J. Smith. That we don't know much more about her, I should say, than that. She was probably an art teacher, because the dedication on the previous page is of Miss J. Smith at Adwick Hall in Doncaster in Yorkshire in 1817, and she was probably kind of creating this as maybe some sort of extra income generator for herself. Only 2 of these survive. There were only 100 made, so it is incredibly rare. We've got one, and there's one at the University Library in Cambridge. If you move on to the next slide. So that if we talked about what literature was there for the kind of teaching, there was also a kind of burgeoning literature for adults as well. One of my favourite works in our whole collection is this work called Flora Domestica by Elizabeth, or Bess as she was known, Kent. And this is the very first guide to container gardening. It's 1822, so towns are developing, particularly in England at the time. People have smaller plots and they're also moving more. So you would grow plants in containers, and as Elizabeth had to move from place to place, she'd take her plants with her. She's an incredibly accomplished gardener. There are 100 plants included in this work, and our head gardener had a read of it, and she says there's not very much I would change, just bearing in mind the kind of impact of climate change on how you would propagate plants today. There's not much that for a southern English climate, southern English town, which is what she's writing about, that we would change today. She is probably the forgotten of the young romantics. Her social circle and intellectual circle are the Shelleys, Byron, Keats, and that's because her brother-in-law is their publisher, Leigh Hunt, who is, again, a man who had both a positive and a really quite negative influence on her life. Yes, she was his intellectual companion. When he is imprisoned for libel, she moves into prison with him. That obviously causes quite a consternation, a little bit of nudging and winking, in which he absolutely fuels with the publishing of a poem called The Story of Rimini, in which he sort of suggests that maybe the relationship is improper. He's married to her sister Marianne, and they have many children. They're terrible with money. They're always having to move house. Bess lives with them, hence why she gets particularly adept at moving plants from place to place and knows what to do with them. This sort of scandal has a terrible impact on her mental health, and she attempts suicide in 1817. Her recovery is in part because she recovers amongst flowers and plants and the caring for those. And you can read this. This book is a Google kind of ebook. And the preface to this is one of the most beautiful evocations of the importance of plants through a person's life, both to mark and symbolize events, but to brighten everyone's day up, and the importance of plants to kind of well-being as well. It's 200 years before its time. It's absolutely beautiful, but it shows how well read she is. It shows how well connected she is, because she doesn't illustrate this with drawing, she really illustrates it with quotes from literature. And whilst most of the poetry that she quotes we know very well today, in 1822 some of these would have been quite new discoveries, and indeed she writes a little bit about that in her preface. But she's starting to start this kind of literature to weave in references in folklore and in literature, and is kind of slightly moving away from the science side of writing. If you move on to the next slide. She so that there you can see she's moving into kind of quoting various different bits of literature. She quotes Keats an awful lot. They corresponded when he was a particularly young man. Next slide. This is a beautiful quote, but does sort of lean towards the fact that as you move through the 19th century, there's a very unscientific, for a sort of series on science, but a very unscientific fashion, which becomes almost a mania, that flowers have not a language, as she refers to, but that every sort of flower, every sort of kind of species and colour are infused with some sort of meaning. Every flower must have a meaning. And if you think you're in a sort of staid Victorian society where maybe you can't express what you feel about someone, express your love for someone, to someone that you shouldn't be corresponding with, then actually being able to sort of secretly tell somebody by sending them a particular flower is quite an enticing way of thinking. Of course, it works the other way as well, in which you could send flowers that said, I know what you're up to. I don't think since we've done this exhibition, any of us at Chawton have sent anyone some yellow roses, because that was a signifier of infidelity. So sort of, I know that you're up to something you shouldn't. You might warn someone by sending them yellow roses. Next slide, please. And this all comes together, sort of getting towards the end of that, so quite a little way outside the Regency now, with the publication of Anne Pratt's Encyclopedia, which is the Flowering Plants and Ferns of Great Britain. This is absolutely beautiful, huge encyclopedia, 5 volumes of plants. She's self-taught. She's self-taught both as an artist and as a scientist, but this is the culmination of 20 years' work. And into this, she weaves in all the things we've talked about. She weaves in gardening and literature and folklore and the uses of plants, and including in this the poisons for nightshade, which is the slide you can see in front of you. And she illustrates it with these extremely beautiful, on the next slide, chromolithographs. There's 300 of these through the volumes. It's absolutely spectacular. So who are the sorts of people who would be using these books if we get back to women in the gardens? Well, come to the next slide. It would be like the women who were living in Chawton and at Chawton House. The lady on the left is Adela Portal, who marries Edward Austin Knight's eldest son. She's his second wife. And the trio on the left, well, the woman is Marianne Knight, Edward Austin Knight's middle daughter. Edward and Elizabeth had 11 children. She's the middle daughter. She never married. She ran part of Gomersham Park, I should say, until Edward died. And then when he does, because she is a 52-year-old unmarried woman with no independent income, she's sort of passed around the family. It's quite heartbreaking to see. She lives until her 80s. But after Edward dies, she moves to Chawton to live with the man in that picture, who is her brother, Charles, and that's their nephew in the picture. Now, both Marianne and Adela create garden books. So they create their own garden notebooks, which are on the next slide. The Adela's, which is on the left, which she actually does with Charles, who is in the picture, we discovered about a week before the exhibition and is being transcribed at the moment by one of our volunteers. It's an absolutely precious discovery for us, because it'll be able to tell us more about the Chawton Gardens and the estates in the middle of the 19th century. And that's something which we've been missing. So this was an absolute wonderful discovery at the back of a box of Knight family material that Richard Knight didn't know he had. We did know that Marianne's garden book, which is both for the rectory where she lived with her brother, who was the vicar at the church, of the village church, and also talks about plants on the estate, on the Chawton estate, and she loves her roses. There are lists and lists and lists of roses, and both these books are 1840s in Adela's case and 1850s in Marianne's case, and again gives us kind of rich information about what the estates might have looked like in the 1850s. And shows their interest in gardening that they had. So our very last, because I've slightly run over, so our very last botanical woman, and I'm afraid we are a long way outside the Regency, but we are still within the Austen family, is Florence Knight. And Florence is Adela's daughter-in-law, so she marries Adela's eldest son, Montague, and they run Chawton House from the 1870s onwards, and they are responsible for the most beautiful, sympathetic and quirky wholesale renovation of Chawton House and the gardens from the 1870s until Montague's death in 1914. And we always knew Montague, this was an enormous kind of lifetime achievement for Montague, but we were a little unsure as to what Florence's role in this is. I'm delighted to say that I can now give this talk with a picture of Florence, because I used to just have the sort of heraldry on our fireplace. It's got her initials on it. So over the last kind of year or so, we've sought out pictures of Florence so that we can have a picture of her in the house. And so this is her. If you move on to the next slide. Her and Montague created the lower part of Chawton Gardens. They restored a lot of the gardens and created this lower library terrace and also the upper library terrace. And it shows their mixture of kind of sentimentality and the kind of historic kind of appreciation of the kind of historic, the family history that they had, as well as their willingness to embrace the new and take a risk. That the upper library terrace is a copy from Florence's childhood home at Chilham Castle in Kent, and the lower library terrace was created by designed by Edwin Lutyens, who, as one of Britain's foremost architects in the first half of the 20th century, goes on to design the cenotaph and large parts, I should say, of New Delhi. But when he was a very junior student architect, he tried his hand on the country estates of Hampshire and Surrey, and that included our lower library terrace. And what Florence tells us, if you move on to the next slide, is what was planted there. And as everybody did in lockdown, Richard Knight decided to go and investigate some boxes at the back of a barn in his farm in Gloucestershire, and he discovered this notebook. This is Florence's notebook, and in it, she lists all the plants that they plant in 1908, which is when they finished the lower library terrace. Which is fabulous for us, because we're going to use this list when we replant and renovate the lower library terrace. So this was discovered in 2020. If you move on to the next slide, what we see is she is influenced by the very, very famous garden designer and garden writer Gertrude Jekyll, who was later became Edwin Lutyens' sort of garden partner in crime, though in good crime. He would design the garden features, and Gertrude Jekyll would design the planting plans. She had no knowledge. She didn't live that far away from Chawton, but she had no hand in the planting plans at Chawton. But her books were very, very widely read. And really, as we talk through all these different areas of kind of botany and horticulture, she is the one who breaks one of the final frontiers, which is to be a professional garden designer. And she sets up with friends and colleagues some of the first professional training schools for female gardeners, for women gardeners. And this is our first edition copy of her book, her extremely popular book from 1901, Home and Garden. And we think Florence was influenced by these sorts of planting, Florence and Montague, and this is what Chawton House planting would have looked like. If you move on to the next slide. This is my fate of everything in the book is a list of plants that were in flower on Christmas Day in 1907, which we assume was probably quite a warm Christmas, though we think once we've looked into it that her and Montague were creating a really unusual alpine garden. So that's our next stage of research into this Botanical Women project. And Chawton House Garden looks like this on the next slide today. So that's our lower library terrace today. Later in the spring, I took that last May, and the gardens are part of our visitor offer They are planted so that visitors can visit them 11 months of the year. They really are spectacular, and in keeping with this sort of history of both horticultural and botanical women, our head gardener is now a woman, Julia Weaver, and she will. We will together oversee the sort of next 10 years of development at Chawton House Gardens, inspired by many of the women that I've talked to you about this evening. The last slide has any questions? And I'm sorry I've slightly run over there.
Very nice. Thank you so much. That was a delight.
Thank you so much. That was, and what beautiful images too.
I remember seeing some of those volumes in person, and the sheer size of some of them was just hard to reproduce, isn't it? Certainly
the Miss Smith. We had to create a special case in order to put it in. It was so big.
Wow.
So yes, it is an enormous book.
Well, thank you so much. And also just a note to our audience, you can still put questions in the chat and we will ask them to Katie right now for our Q&A. And if you don't have a YouTube account, once again, you can email them to us at info@janeaustenandco.org. So we're going to start off with a question I will post up here. How was a garden a reflection of a woman's class in terms of whether or not a woman used her servants' help in the garden? How many women were doing their own manual labor in gardening?
That's a really interesting question. I think that, even Henrietta Knight, with her, creating her garden with her staff. So some of that she's doing herself, but some of it she has a gardener and she has her staff to help with. So she does talk about kind of pushing the shells into the outside of her grotto and creating the inside of her grotto. She might be quite unusual. Certainly someone like I mentioned, Elizabeth Montagu, there's no dirt getting underneath her fingernails at all. In fact, her letters, and you can read her letters, her correspondence, is being steadily digitized, and is you can read that online through I think it's through Swansea University. But she writes about how watching the kind of the labourers on her estates doing the garden, and how wonderful and wholesome an activity as it is as she sits in her lovely garden kind of garden window. Although someone like the Austins, of course, they're doing their garden themselves in Chawton Cottage, because it's kind of much smaller. So yeah, it really was. You're right. It's absolutely a reflection of your kind of class and social status, as to how much of it you're doing yourself. And women would, to a sense, there were occasions where women were employed to sort of help keep gardens tidy, not as professional gardeners. As I said, you have to wait all the way until to the very late part of the 19th century, early 20th century for that to happen. But women would be seasonally employed to sort of keep parterres and formal flower gardens kind of free of slugs and snails and stones and things like that, but were probably paid less than the boys who were also seasonal labor. Whole families might offer themselves to do that sort of what's the word? Yeah, to do that sort of seasonal labor. So yes, it's absolutely not just who was working your garden, but what you had in your garden is a reflection of your sort of social status and networks. I don't think Elizabeth Montagu is imploring her sister to collect mignonette seeds, as unlikely as Jane Austen would to insist Cassandra arrange the transport of 12 orange trees.
Well, fantastic answer. Thank you.
I'm really intrigued by the whole idea of where people are getting their ideas, and it sounds like from some of what you showed us, there's correspondence from one gardener to another, but also I've just been reading Cooper, the task. And Austen, in her letters to Cassandra, when they're thinking about moving into Chawton Cottage, is saying, well, we've got to have a laburnum for Cooper's line. And Cooper goes through all these plants and even talks about how to do a compost heap. I mean, I've never read a poem about composting, but it's kind of amazing. So where would people in the Austen's kind of socioeconomic class be getting most of their garden ideas? From neighbors?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of from what they see and who they see and what they've, what they read about, I suppose. But I think a lot of it is, and actually, I mean, all of us who garden today, we see things that we like, and we go, oh, I might have a go at that. I might see if that works in my garden. And so I think that probably ideas are through, you're right, seasoned through what they've read. And I should say there is not. Of the works that I mentioned, almost every single one of them in some way mentions Cooper or quotes Cooper. Any of those works that are quoting have literary quotes embedded within them, whether it's the educational literature or it's the kind of instruction, the guides like Elizabeth Kent, Anne Pratt. Cooper is liberally sprinkled throughout all, as is actually Maria Edgeworth as well. But they are, yes, they're kind of liberally sprinkled throughout there. So I think, yes, it is what you see and what you experience, which is why I said at the beginning, I think your garden is probably a reflection of your social circle, and where you live as much as anything else. And some of the loveliest letters of Mary Russell Mitford are of her joy at visiting other people's gardens. But I guess those of us who are gardeners, when we go and visit people who've got a nice garden, we'll go out into the garden and have a look. And so I guess that's a sort of perennial, oh, pardon the pun, human being.
So there's some. Oh, actually, Gilpin also had, people like that also say big suggestions on plantings for the right effect. Another question here, building on the social status issue. This viewer is asking about the role of utility. To what extent would women be creating gardens for beauty, and to what extent for utilitarian purposes? And also, just in terms of those lists you've shown us of plants at Chawton, I'm wondering how many of those had utility versus.
Well, I think that's certainly with Jekyll planting. So we're now obviously kind of late 19th, early 20th century, and certainly I think in England the Jekyll style planting has had a renaissance recently as well. There's not utility in terms of it being herbs for use in the kitchen or things like that. Jekyll's planting and so kind of Florence's planting, the utility there is we'll create a garden that looks good from April through to October. So the way in which you place plants, and that's where Jekyll's planting schemes are so clever, is the kind of the way in which you have plants in these sort of huge, dense country garden style herbaceous borders, is that the way you place them allows them to flourish and then to sort of die hidden by the plant that's then grown in front of them or behind them, and it shields them. So sort of the utility, and it's perennial as well. So Jekyll is a very sensible gardener. You don't want to be doing this year on year on year. She also says she's a great fan of kind of what we've got, a wilderness, which she says if you've got areas of woodland, cultivate 20% of your garden and then leave part of the rest of it, have trees and leave part of the rest of it to nature. Whether I think Henrietta Knight's garden, Lady Luxembourg's garden, is unusual is because it has to be productive and she wants it to look beautiful, and that's quite a particular set of circumstances that she found herself in. Though I dare say it would be useful to have and that's probably why it features so much in some of the educational literature, is the kind of uses of plants and the uses of fruits and berries and different sorts of herbs, that kind of you make the best of what you've got. I think if you've not got the sort of the resources of someone like, for example, Elizabeth Montagu, again, her garden's not, there's no utility involved in that at all.
Thank you.
I do realize a couple of my slides might have been blurry, and I will resend you those images. I thought that might have been the hotel Wi-Fi last night. A couple of Mariah's illustrations.
Okay, I've got a question here from somebody. Let me pop it onto the screen. So in botanic gardens, the contributions of male botanists are celebrated and widely recognized. So this is a kind of, what can we do now? How can we better represent and reveal the work of women from this time in botanic gardens?
Well, I think Claire's dead right there. But there are some remarkable women associated with botanic gardens. There are writers like very early, like the diarist, the traveller and diarist Celia Fiennes, who, as she's travelling the country in the 1690s, and she visits every English county, which she does on horseback, side saddle. Making notes as she goes. She is fabulous. There's an entire other hour's talk in Celia Fiennes. But as she's going, she makes copious notes and very vivid descriptions of the gardens. And one of those that she makes a really vivid description of is the Oxford Botanic Garden at the university, which you know, that to be able to have those sort of early descriptions is one. Really more. And one way which the sort of Royal Botanic Garden here in London at Kew has done is to celebrate their illustrators. Because if women were being taught botanical illustration, as I showed with Miss Smith's textbook, I suppose, is that they then became a very useful skill in order to capture, in an age before photography, be able to capture the kind of specimens, whether that's whilst you're out on expedition or if you've brought them back. One illustrator who we featured in the exhibition, and we'll feature throughout the course of this year, is Elizabeth Blackwell, who was I think produced the first illustrated English language herbal in the 1730s, and she utilised her artistic abilities, seeing a gap in the market that people wouldn't necessarily know what these specimens coming to the shores for the first time are, being, in her case, propagated at the Chelsea Physic Garden down by the Thames. It's on the sort of north side of the Thames, but it's a real kind of secluded, still very secluded garden with its own microclimate, which meant they could then, and they still can, grow plants that you wouldn't necessarily be able to grow elsewhere in this country. And it was set up by the by the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries. So it's a physic garden that's useful. It's meant for medicine. And she illustrated 500 plants, many of which may have been unfamiliar to the people who were collecting the plates and subscribing to her work. So I think it's celebrating those women, and you can start to, because that was as important as the plant collector in his breeches and his, with his secateurs or whatever the 18th century, 19th century equivalent of it was. And there are stories, and I would love to uncover them, and they're maybe not in our collection, of women plant hunters, and who kind of found themselves on ships or kind of lied and disguised themselves to get on ships to go on expeditions. I couldn't uncover any of those in the collection, but I'd love to find out more about who they are, because that's some incredible stories.
What about porcelain painters? Because I know Meissen, for example, was with its famous flower pattern porcelains was very active during this whole period that you're discussing.
Yeah.
Actually, my sister-in-law was a Meissen. She was the #2 color flower painter for Meissen. But so I'm wondering whether whether there was a history of women being porcelain painters as well. Do you of botanical porcelain painters? Do you know?
I don't. But that would be a fascinating avenue to go down. And I guess it signifies that when you're looking at, in some cases, kind of more hidden histories or histories that were not documented through the written word, is that you have to kind of look down these little alleyways to find them. You have to look at the notes in the margin, or the illustrations on the side of the porcelain or something like that. That you have to explore these different avenues in order to find the voice that when they didn't have a voice at that time. That's a fascinating way of thinking about things.
I'm kind of intrigued by this discussion of drawing these things as well, because going back to what you were saying about Linnaeus and Darwin and the way they were kind of anthropomorphizing the plants, that really becomes dangerous then for women. Richard Polwhele has that crazy poem, The Unsexed Female, where he talks about all the women writers during this period, and and other women. One of the things he's really upset about is botany. That botany allows girls and women to be thinking about the prostitution of plants and their sexual parts. And then he says, I have even seen boys and girls botanizing together. So, getting too involved with the specifics is dangerous.
Yeah, which I think is kind of makes that the sort of the emerging genre of literature which really sanitizes it, because these are quite, if you read the kind of they're quite twee stories that are written. As it's a really sweet little book we've got, which is the kind of opposite to the Miss Smith, it's about this big, called Botanical Rambles, where one sister takes her siblings on a series of increasingly implausible walks around some sort of botanic utopia, which I think is somewhere in the Cotswolds, until you really can't stretch your imagination too far and they go into the hothouse and then into the library. But it is, and I talked about the kind of social attitudes, but they have kind of stripped away all of the kind of any sort of controversy or anything like that. But then there is equally other genres of literature that lean much more into that, which is a less wholesome, I'm sure, exhibition and pursuit. But yeah, you're right, and I think it is problematic at the time, but it can't get away from the fact that that's now the blank classification, and they kind of stuck with this kind of free and easy way of describing it, which is why actually I think Murray Jackson is unusual, and I quite like the fact she's clearly so angry with her brother, rightfully, that she kind of leans into more of Linnaeus's gendered language. But yeah, there's I think it is, I suppose, when anything is new and complicated, it gives rise to extreme opinions on both sides.
So for our next question from the audience, I'm really glad somebody asked this, because I'm very curious about this myself. How many plants in the garden today are native to England, and how many were brought from other countries at some point in time? And I'm thinking specifically in this time period of the story of William Curtis, who created this beautiful hand-illustrated Flora Londinensis, which was just a most extravagant botanical volume. And it was all about native plants in England, and it was a commercial failure because a lot of the plants were considered weedy. So then his next endeavor was to create the Botanical magazine, which only featured plants from North America and Asia and other parts of Europe, and was, of course, a commercial success. So how, was that like an isolated example? Were there different periods of time in which native versus imported plants were popular during this time period?
It's I love that story. It's like, oh, our plants are too boring, we're not going to buy it. No, it's well, actually, in terms of in England and with or in Britain, really, with that with our climate, actually comparatively few of plants that we consider now to be kind of traditional cottage garden or native plants aren't. I mean, we've just finished our snowdrop season at Chawton House. We have one of the most extraordinary, spectacular displays of naturalised snowdrops in the county. And but snowdrops themselves were brought to the country in the 16th century. So even something that might be now be considered sort of an English winter flower. So I think, again, it's as you have this kind of age of discovery and enlightenment, there's curiosity about things that are new, about being able to propagate new plants. And if you've got the connections and the wealth and the means by which you can propagate plants, if you've got hot houses, for example, then you're going to try and do that and introduce plants. That's how pelargoniums, for example, are introduced into England. It's a very wealthy female collector, the Duchess of Somerset, who has this extraordinary array of hot houses at Beaufort House. But she perfects the propagation of pelargoniums for the first time. But she's phenomenally wealthy. And so she can afford to pay the seed collectors and the plant collectors to go out and bring the specimens back and have enough for her to experiment on. So I think there's the kind of class and that wealth really comes into it. That yes, I can see you're not going to want to collect your kind of native plants if really you want to show off your wealth with citrus plants, for example, or pelargoniums, or something that needs to grow in a hothouse, tropical fruit or something like that. I think that comes almost sort of full circle, if you like, because and again I mentioned Jekyll. She talks about a kind of country garden. She's not averse to using things that are not strictly kind of native plants of England, but there's a sort of tradition to a kind of traditional use of plants. But and now I think there's a kind of move away from the kind of exotic. But even there's always an example that breaks the rules. So fuchsias, for example, which are clearly not native to England, and whether this is an apocryphal tale, it was in Jenny Uglow's History of Gardening, that the first fuchsia that came to England was brought by a sailor who saw it, thought it was beautiful, brought it back for his sweetheart. She put it in a pot on a windowsill. They were somewhere in, I think it's in London, and an enterprising plant collector saw it and did a deal with her for the first kind of 50 cuttings, I think it was, or something like that. And that's the story as to how fuchsias ended up in England. And now you can't imagine a country garden without a fuchsia. So it's but in the short answer is there's very few that are strictly native to England.
All a matter of how far back you go, right?
Exactly.
So with orange trees then also, one of the viewers asks, brought from Seville in Spain, do you know?
I don't know where the original Bulstrode orange trees came from. All I know is they're an unscheduled long stop in Slough for Montague and the Duchess of Portland. So I'm not sure where they I'm not sure where they would have kept. I mean, I think that's probably a rather informed guess to say yes, somewhere like Spain.
Yeah. So I mean, there were also at different points political overtones, right, to whether or not you use the local or the imported plant. I mean, with the pride in the new English garden, with the picturesque and so forth. I mean, part of what was so exciting was that we had that people now wildflowers, the local wildflowers were now celebrated, and they didn't have to be the exotic cultivated plants.
Exactly. No, I think you're right. And now I think there's certainly locally around Hampshire. I said we've got an estate, 250 acre estate, and one of the projects that we're doing this year is to replant a wildflower meadow, and most of the plants there would probably now be what we would consider to be more native plants to the area, and certainly to the kind of the soil and the climate that we have in Northeast Hampshire, and that's very much encouraged now. But no, I think you're right. There must be other political symbolism through what sort of plants you were propagating throughout the period that we've discussed, and times when it was better than not to be propagating some things, I'm sure.
I've got another question here that's very interesting. Would they have brought plants indoors during the winter, and especially with this kind of influx of new plants?
Yes.
As well as were greenhouses or conservatories only for the wealthy, and were there things that people who weren't wealthy could, use, like little glass panes or something like that?
Yeah, I imagine your scale, you could, and actually that's something that in Elizabeth Kent's book in Flora Domestica, that she talks about protecting plants from inclement weather and moving pots. So that's one of the things of container gardening, being able to move pots around. So she does talk about the kind of practicalities of what we would say kind of protecting from frost and things like that. At Chawton House, there were glass houses in the walled garden. So if you think Chawton was a country manor house, so it's not, they're not aristocracy. It's not an estate in the sort of almost the sort of size even that, we've talked about Duchess of Portland and Elizabeth Montagu, but those kind of big country estates, Chatsworth, Blenheim, those kind of huge estates have kind of complexes of hot houses. Chawton had a series in the walled garden, and walled gardens were and still do offer that kind of protection from inclement weather. So your walled garden is always going to be a couple of degrees warmer and protect from some of the worst of the weather. It might even be one of the reasons why Edward Austin Knight moved the garden from the front to the most sheltered back of Chawton House, kind of at the top of the hill at the back of the house, because it's much less exposed than being further down at the bottom of the garden. But yeah, there was a kind of row of glass houses and greenhouses at Chawton House. We've got a project over the next 3 years is to restore the footing, not the glasswork. Now it would be very hot, and very expensive. But to restore the footings of those, so you could see the kind of extent of the kind of more protected areas and the glass houses that there were in what was a sort of fairly modest middle of the road country manor house. When Florence and Montagu developed the lower library terrace, the side of the lower library terrace had a sort of orangery glass house on it, like a very mini orangery, which is in keeping with what Montagu sort of saw some of the great, I think, sort of bigger houses, and he created a much sort of miniature version. So I think it was a miniature orangery. Whether that was a kind of fashion or it was Montagu's eccentricity, I think it might have been the latter, really. So yeah, Elizabeth Kent's book suggests that people knew about the seasonality and moving plants to be more protected areas, and I guess worked with what they've got and worked with what they had.
Thank you.
Well, to finish us off tonight, there's a lot of really good questions left, but I think this is a really good one to end off on. You know, regarding the personal journals that you found and that you showed us tonight, what are you guys doing with them in the future? Are you planning on doing like a botanical history? Have you been cross-referencing them? What are the plans for those?
So for a start, it's nice to hear from Betty. We know Emma found, our curator, found Adela's Botanical Journal a week before we opened the exhibition, which is, anyone who works in a museum will know, you find the thing you really want to display a week before you open and you've got nowhere to put it. And the thing with Adela's, rather than Marianne's, so Adela's is very kind of high Victorian. And it's got all sorts of shells and seeds stuck to the front of it. So so the reason I showed you that it's kind of half open is that's what Emma could open before she was a bit scared that things were going to crack and fall off. So our conservators, we have a team of 3 volunteer book conservators who've all been trained by the British Library at Chawton, who are amazing, super talented people, and they've stabilized Adela's books so things can stop falling off it. And so what we're doing now, Martin, who's our house historian, is going through it because he's done quite a lot of research into Adela and the portals separately. And also he has the time and I sadly don't. So I had to kind of relinquish the, okay, you transcribe it, because obviously I'm never going to get a chance to do it. So he's currently transcribing Adela's book. And Marianne's, I photographed all of Marianne's book. Hers is a little bit more difficult to decipher because it is quite eccentric. One of the things you could see on the slide that I showed you is that she goes for a walk, maybe after, like a year or so, I suppose, after she's done the original list, puts a line through it and just writes "dead" next to it. It's descriptive, so you can work out what doesn't grow at Chawton. That's quite helpful. But it does sort of obscure what originally was there because she's just sort of black lined it through "dead." So there's some kind of interesting elements. I need to try and work out what Marianne was doing with her book. So there are clearly bits that are Chawton. There's bits where she writes lists of plants that she's either seen or acquired from other places in Hertfordshire, Herefordshire. And then there's things where she's out on the estate. And so hers requires a bit more study. The photograph I included, in fact, all the photography I've done of her book, which is at Hampshire Records Office, because although it's owned by Richard Knight, it's in the archive rather than with us. I went to see them during COVID because I wanted to borrow the book, but I said I need to photograph it first because I need to know what's in it so I could write the labels and the boards. But because it was this totally mad point of COVID, where I wasn't allowed to go into the archive, but they were allowed to bring the book out to me. So, which I'm sure is terrible archival practice. So they put this book on a tea trolley on wheels, and they rolled it out of the side of a goods lift to the edge of a car park where Emma and I had parked. And so that's why the picture, because you had about 10 minutes to photograph it because it was out in the, blazing sunshine. So that's why the pictures aren't very good. They've got my sunglasses in one side of it and the object record in the other, and me and Emma quickly trying to photograph every single page of it to try and work out what it is. So now we can go back in. So Marianne's requires a bit more. Florence's little notebook is much easier to decipher. And I think her little notebook is genuinely a book of things she wants people in the future to know. So it's not all about the garden, but the plant lists, and they're we've deciphered all of her handwriting is really easy to read. There's a heartbreaking line in it that says, "We bless the garden, me and the vicar," and it's 3 months after Montague's died, and she's clearly just in 2 lines you sort of see the heartbroken bit. But her so yes, answer to Betty's question, yes, we absolutely will weave it into both the development of garden and the stories we tell of the garden. But there are some of the things within Florence's book that I want to look into, particularly the one page that has 2 lines on it that says Edward Bradfield lost his arm to a tiger in Mumbai and the date. And that's it. Like, Flo, you've left me hanging. Whoa. That's the story. So yeah, Florence's notebook will take us through the garden, but I think it'll be the start of a few other stories as well.
Katie, this was just a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes,
and for our people in our audience, thank you for joining us and bearing with us with our new system. We have just a few announcements before we go for the night. Coming up next week, we have another event in our Everyday Science series. We're going to be talking with physicist Chris Clemens about time and the heavens in Regency life. This will be a really interesting chance to talk to a scientist about the history of science. And you can, of course, sign up for that at janeaustenandco.org/sign up. And then we have more events on the horizon coming up on April 18th. Portrait of a Woman in Silk. If you were interested in tonight's discussion of botanics and are interested in seeing other ways in which botanics were in the culture at the time, Zara is going to be talking about the production of silk through a female silk designer who used botanical designs that became very popular. So it's combining technology and popular science. Registration for both of these events is open now. And then, of course, later on, we will have talks on sea bathing and the comforts of home cures. So be sure to join us this series.
Exciting. And remember that registration for the Jane Austen Summer Program 2023 is still open. Our theme this year is Austen's Teenage Writings. We'll be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for a weekend of balls, workshops, discussion groups, which are really wonderful, lectures, and other exciting activities.
And just a couple teasers about that. Some people that you may know, wonderful speakers are coming, including Juliet McMaster, and all the way from Japan, Kimio Ogawa is coming. We have some novelists, especially of YA Austen adaptations, including Maria Grace of the Dragons in Austen, and Sayatani Dasgupta, who wrote Debating with Darcy and others. We also will have a visit by the person who made the only feature film based on the teenage writings, which is Whit Stillman, who made the Love and Friendship. This program, our series, was supported in part by North Carolina Humanities, which is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we'd also like to thank UNC's Humanities for the Public Good, a project of College of Arts and Sciences with support from Andrew W. Mellon Foundation.
And we'd like to thank all of you who donated tonight to support our event. Thanks to you guys, we can bring wonderful speakers like Katie Childs to Jane Austen and Company. So thank you all for joining us again, and we hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.